Finally following up on the promise I made 1 year ago, it's time to give some attention to the Zelda series. Tears of the Kingdom, the long-awaited sequel to Breath of the Wild, is coming out in just a few short months. In the lead up to the game's release, I want to revisit every 3D Zelda game and see if they've stood the test of time and whether any of my opinions on them have changed, since there are a couple that I haven't played in years. While I would like to cover the 2D games as well, frankly, there's enough games to talk about as is when just looking at the 3D entries, and, like with the 2D Metroid videos, I'd like to keep things simple and just focus on one side of Zelda's legendary legacy for now. A legacy that I've been following since my early middle school days, when I played the game that is the subject of today's video, Ocarina of Time. I am very excited to share what these games personally mean to me and how I feel about each one of them. Cause until now, I haven't really covered any of Nintendo's A-listers, so it's kind of cool to finally dedicate a whole retrospective to one of the big boys. In case you're wondering what versions I'll be looking at, since every game on the list, minus Breath of the Wild, has had a remake, for Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, I'm going to play through both the N64 and 3DS versions, as I feel that there's quite a bit I can say about the differences between the two versions. Wind Waker HD and Twilight Princess HD don't have as many updates that I feel warrant 2 playthroughs, though I won't skimp out on covering the version differences for those two games either. And as for Skyward Sword, well, I already made a standalone video on that game over a year ago that primarily focused on the HD version. Because it's the most recent one I've played and I don't think I have much more to add to what I already said, I don't think I'll be making an updated review or anything like that. I feel it would be a little redundant, even if it would be nice to make it fit more in line with the rest of the Zelda reviews. I'll still find a way to squeeze it in some form though, maybe at the end of the Twilight Princess video or at the beginning of the Breath of the Wild video. I may change my mind, but I may not either. Okay, exposition over. Let's kick things off with the most critically acclaimed game of all time. Wow, starting off strong already. This is The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Zelda is one of Nintendo's oldest flagship IPs, getting its start on the Famicom Disk System and NES in 1986 and 1987 respectively, with the release of The Legend of Zelda, coming in a spiffy gold NES cart that I thought was a limited edition for the longest time before finding out that every copy was gold. Thank God I didn't spend $60 on it when I saw it at a used game store 10 years ago. Zelda was created to be an opposite to Super Mario Bros. Instead of being about stomping Koopas, Zelda was a fantasy adventure game that was completely non-linear. You controlled a young hero named Link, exploring the wasteland that is NES Hyrule to find the 8 pieces of the Triforce of Wisdom, except it isn't a Triforce in this game because the Triforce of Courage didn't exist yet. You rescue the Princess of Hyrule, Zelda, and stop the evil blue pig Ganon by shoving a silver arrow up his ass. It was innovative, imaginative, hard as balls, no really, where the hell do I go? And it became a sensation, with legendary talent like Shigeru Miyamoto, Takashi Tezuka, a catchy overworld theme composed by Koji Kondo, and of course Eiji Aonuma. Zelda was on its way to becoming a name to be respected. Then Zelda 2 came out and that one wasn't as well received, throwing gamers off with its changing gameplay style and structure, botched translation, and brutal difficulty that made the first game seem like peanuts in comparison. When the next generation system came along, the series went back to the original gameplay style with a top-down perspective, and it just so happened to be one of the greatest games of all time. It's insane just how much of what people love about Zelda nowadays can be traced back to A Link to the Past, and it was only the 3rd installment in the series. Nintendo really hit it out of the park with number 3s back in the day now that I think about it. A Link to the Past success became the framework for Zelda's inevitable leap into the 3rd dimension. 3D was all the rage in the mid-90s. Not this 3D, this 3D. Look at those triangles, this is the future, motherfuckers. When the Nintendo 64 came out, Super Mario 64 blew everybody's socks off, so imagine what a 3D take on Zelda would do. Mario 64 and the new Zelda were actually in development at the same time, even sharing some assets during production that appeared in the final versions. Zelda 64, as it was known as at the time, was going to be unlike any game that had ever been made that would introduce brand new gameplay mechanics, like a targeting system to make sword combat in a 3D environment actually doable. At one point, Miyamoto even suggested a first-person perspective for the new Zelda game. Now that's a ROM hack I'd love to see. The first footage of Zelda 64 was shown off in 1995 and featured a model of Link based on the official artwork of Zelda 1. It wasn't a very long tech demo, but it got people very excited. The goal was to have the game out by late 1997, but this is a 3D Zelda game. Delays come included as part of the package deal. Zelda 64 was being made to take advantage of the 64 disk drive, and this trailer from 1996 is actually a build of the game running on that hardware. Look at that, 2 reviews in a row where I get to mock this thing. As I said in the Mother 3 video, the 64DD was an add-on for the main N64 unit that used an irrelevant disk format, but it had an internal clock which could be used for the day and night cycle, so why not? The game eventually moved over to a standard cartridge format, which is what the Space World 1997 build ran on. Content kept having to be cut out though, and this cut content was planned to be reworked into an expansion dubbed Zelda that would actually be released for the 64DD this time. Once again, this ended up being cancelled, but remnants of the project were shelved to be used at a later date. Zelda 64, now given the final name The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, was quickly becoming one of the most anticipated video games ever, with some retailers even having to stop pre-orders because of the super high demand for the limited gold cartridge edition of the game. And honestly, it's easy to understand why. I wasn't even alive when Ocarina of Time came out, so all I can do is try to put myself in the shoes of someone who was eagerly waiting for the game to come out, and imagine how exciting it must have been to see advertising for something that was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. Ocarina of Time was Nintendo's answer to all those flashy AAA cutscene heavy games that made the PlayStation so popular. Only difference now was that these cutscenes weren't pre-rendered FMVs that clashed with the actual in-game visuals. Everything in these trailers and commercials was running in-engine. The gameplay wasn't going to be turn-based or compromised in any way. Players would have complete and total control of this 3D adventure. And on November 21st, 1998, the world got its hands on Ocarina of Time and the entire landscape of gaming changed forever. To this day, Ocarina of Time is the most critically acclaimed video game ever. People went and still do go absolutely bananas over this game, over how seemingly effortless the transition from 2D to 3D was handled. It wasn't just good for a first attempt, it was just good. No ifs, ands, or buts. This should not have been possible. There were so many ways that this game could have failed, and I'm not trying to hype Ocarina of Time up as this flawless, infallible, gold-plated masterpiece, because it isn't flawless, of course it's not. But damn, for the time that it came out, it was about as perfect as it could have possibly been. And no matter what I say about it in this video, good or bad, that is something that will always make me have a great deal of respect for this game, and nobody can say anything to convince me otherwise. The planned expansion I mentioned earlier, Zelda, while it never saw the light of day, ideas from that project made their way into one of Ocarina of Time's many re-releases. Bundled with the GameCube release of the original game, Ocarina of Time Master Quest was designed to be more challenging for players who had mastered the original, featuring remixed dungeons with stronger enemies and more brain-taxing puzzles. Master Quest is similar to another game that was designed to be a more difficult version of a pre-existing popular title, Super Mario Bros. 2 The Lost Levels. Sure, except if Lost Levels wasn't complete horseshit. Okay, take that with a grain of salt because Master Quest seems to get mixed reception from what I've noticed, and I can't really form an opinion on it because I've never played it from beginning to end. I gave it a shot after I beat Ocarina of Time 3D and gave up when I died in the Great Deku Tree. Only recently did I play it a bit more because I was making this video, and by that I mean I actually completed the first dungeon this time. And it really is a more difficult version of Ocarina of Time, even if we're just focusing on the revamped dungeons. Definitely not meant for beginners, and well, it didn't help that the version I played was a 3DS version, which is even harder than the GameCube version for reasons that I will explain later. Speaking of this little system, in 2011 Nintendo released the Nintendo 3DS, a handheld with horsepower nearly on par with the GameCube, and a selling point that everyone forgot about a month after buying the thing. Glasses-free 3D was a legitimately enticing feature, especially during the time of the 3DS's release when the technology was getting a bit of a resurgence. There were just two problems. The system launched with games not a ton of people cared about, and glasses-free 3D wasn't going to be light on your wallet or the eyes of your children. But Nintendo did promise some pretty noteworthy games releasing later in the 3DS's launch year, one of them being a full-blown remake of Ocarina of Time. Ocarina of Time 3D was built up to be the 3DS's first must-have exclusive. Yeah, exclusive, when the original was available on Wii for $10. I can see now where Sony got their inspiration for the PlayStation 5's biggest launch title, but this remake was looking to be an honest-to-God, from-the-ground-up recreation of the most beloved game of all time, that still promised to be incredibly faithful. Ocarina of Time 3D was the game that made me want a 3DS. Now, I had technically tried out Ocarina of Time already, once via the 5-minute demo included in Super Smash Bros. Brawl, and another time at my friend's house via the Wii Virtual Console, and I fucking hated it. This was before I became more open to trying different games that didn't star Mario or Homer Simpson. Zelda can't jump, this is stupid. But eventually I stopped being so close-minded, and 2011 just so happened to be the year where I became really invested in gaming as a passion. So I was more than happy to try out as many new franchises as I could. Ocarina of Time 3D was my excuse to give the Zelda series an honest try for the first time. I wanted this game badly, and the commercials weren't helping, like the one starring the late Robin Williams and his daughter Zelda. Getting these two to help market the game was absolutely genius.
Yes, Zelda?
Are you mixing me up with the princess again?
Hard to say, you're both pretty magical.
Finally, around August, my parents bought me a Nintendo 3DS with no games. Yeah, I couldn't get a game for it for another 2 weeks, but at least Face Raiders, Street Pass, and the activity log kept me company. Then it happened. I became a girl repellent. Ocarina of Time 3D became one of my favorites and most replayed games ever. I fell in love with it so much. The idea of having a game this big and magical in the palm of my hands was mind-boggling to me, since I was so used to handheld games looking like this. However, I entered an angsty, cynical teenager phase a couple of years later and started to look back on Ocarina of Time with much less reverence. This was for 2 reasons. One, simply put, I think that all of my repeated playthroughs of the game made me grow tired of it, and I started getting tunnel vision, focusing more and more on the things that annoyed me about it. And 2, there's a little video that was posted on YouTube in 2013 that undoubtedly played a huge role in how people discussed Ocarina of Time on the internet. You may or may not have watched it. It only has 13 million views, so I wouldn't blame you if you didn't. Egoraptor Sequelitis on Ocarina of Time is one of the first YouTube videos I remember that blew up that didn't praise this game. He tore it a new ass, and I'm not bringing it up to spark any more arguments than it already has or to attack his opinions. I don't want to be that kind of person, and I'm not gonna lie, I still find a lot of parts of that video to be genuinely funny.
120 pounds? No. It's too low.
I'm bringing it up because I'm trying to be humble by admitting that this video did influence my thoughts on Ocarina of Time for quite a while. I started to view Ocarina of Time in the worst light imaginable, to an absolutely exaggerated and toxic degree, while ignoring everything about it that is genuinely amazing. So I went from loving the game to really disliking it to loving it again when I stopped being a jackass and looked at it fairly. I just wanted to share this story since my style is to make these retrospectives as personal as I can, and omitting it wouldn't sit right with me. Alright, I think I've given plenty of context of where I'm coming from before diving into talking about the game itself. As I said, I played through the N64 and 3DS versions of Ocarina of Time for this video, which probably wasn't as necessary as I initially thought in hindsight, but I knew I was going to want to talk about the differences in each version at least a little, so it's nice that I now have my own footage of both. For the N64 version, I played the version on the Nintendo Switch Online Nintendo 64 app. That's right, I committed a cardinal sin on the internet. I changed my opinion. Had the app not been updated to fix some of the issues that Ocarina of Time had when it launched, then sure, I probably would have emulated it or played it on the Wii U Virtual Console instead. But I try to avoid emulating when I can avoid it, and have you seen N64 games running on the Wii U? Trick question. You can't. Plus, I finally wanted to play an N64 Zelda game with an N64 controller, and this is the closest I'll get without owning an actual N64. This is the best $50 I've ever spent. And for the 3DS version, I got my footage by emulating the game. Though like with Samus Returns, I will be basing what I say about it as if I were playing it on the actual hardware. I do have to apologize about one thing though. When I emulate games for this channel, I try not to enhance them in any way so that they remain as authentic to the originals as possible. But this time I didn't realize until it was too late that the upscaler was toggled on, so the footage looks a little nicer than it should. And for consistency, since I already messed up, I'll be doing the same thing when I record Majora 3D. But but take my word for it, or play the game yourself if you don't believe me. Even without the upscaling, Ocarina of Time 3D is one of the best looking games on the 3DS and one of the most impressive remakes I've ever played. The N64 version's visuals are definitely what have aged it the most. It really pushed that console to its limits. The frame rate is capped at 20 FPS and it can go even lower than that on original hardware. Lots of assets like backgrounds and droppable items are represented as still images and sprites, which was common practice during this generation to avoid tanking performance and to save on storage space, but some areas don't look very good anymore. The textures are very low res and straight up look ugly in some cases, though this does work to the game's benefit at times in areas like the bottom of the well and the Shadow Temple. Replaying this version can feel like a chore though because of the super slow text crawl, and with no way to skip cutscenes, these can go on for a while. The N64's analog stick was also not made for precision aiming. It wasn't made for torture either, and look what happened. Now the 3DS version, on the other hand, in addition to making the controls feel more smooth and adding gyro aiming for items like the bow, gave the game a total visual makeover to better match the official artwork. It's a beautiful remake, and the frame rate has been bumped up to 30 FPS, which makes everything feel way more responsive. Nearly every asset is now a full 3D model, and cutscenes not only sport a much faster text crawl, but also improved cinematography with new camera angles and such. In the original, you could map up to 3 items at a time to either the left, right, or down C buttons. Now, the touchscreen allows for 2 items to be mapped to it, in addition to another 2 being mapped to the X and Y buttons. The touchscreen now also has a dedicated spot for the first-person mode / Navi, the gear, item, and map screens, and the ocarina, which you could now play with either the touchscreen or buttons, and has a little sub-menu containing all of the songs you've learned while you're playing it. And, well, you can play the game in 3D, adding depth to the game's world and making certain elements pop out. You can now also refight any boss you faced by sleeping in Link's bed and challenge yourself by seeing how fast you can beat them. And after you beat the main quest, you unlock Master Quest and these cool looking statues on the save file screen. I mentioned that Master Quest 3D is harder than the original Master Quest, and that's because now you also take double damage, and the entire game is mirrored, just like how the Wii version of Twilight Princess is a mirrored version of the GameCube version. As someone who's played Ocarina of Time more times than I can count, this is weird, but this is definitely the most difficult version of the game if you're interested. I may try to beat it one day, but not today. Now on to the more controversial aspects about this remake. Outside of Link's house and in the Temple of Time, you can find the Sheikah Stone, essentially acting as a walkthrough built into the game in case you ever get stumped during your adventure. There's also visions for telling you where heart pieces are and how to complete certain quests. A lot of Nintendo games around this time were getting called out for including stuff like this. New Super Mario Bros. Wii had the Super Guide, Donkey Kong Country Returns had the Super Kong, but unlike those that straight up completed the level for you, the Sheikah Stones don't do that. They're just here in case you're truly stuck and don't want to spend hours figuring out what you need to do next, which in Ocarina of Time can realistically happen more than once. Also, there's the fact that, come on guys, this is optional. The stone itself does look a little goofy, especially in the Temple of Time. I think it would have been better if there was something in the options menu that you can toggle to remove them if you wanted. Some people also aren't a fan of how the nicer visuals take away from the atmosphere and spookiness of the previously mentioned Bottom of the Well and Shadow Temple. If you ask me, the final boss is the most blatant case of the cleaner graphics taking away from the game's identity, but even then, it doesn't bother me enough to throw a hissy fit. This is overall the best version of the game. Maybe not the definitive version for some people, but the improvements here make it really difficult to justify revisiting the original sometimes. I think it's safe to assume that most people watching have played Ocarina of Time since it's Ocarina of Time. And by extension, I think most people here have also played the other 3D Zelda games. Regardless, I'll include spoiler warnings in all of these videos, though keep in mind that I'll still be referencing spoilery stuff throughout the whole thing. Ocarina of Time is often labeled as a simple retelling of A Link to the Past, which, yeah, they are extremely similar, but I feel that Ocarina does a better job of fleshing out the lore of the series and, of course, being more cinematic. In the Kokiri Forest, Link is the only child among the Kokiri who does not have his own fairy companion. As if being a loner wasn't bad enough, lately he's also been having nightmares about a scary looking man on a dark horse during a dark stormy night. These nightmares are an omen to something more sinister brewing behind the scenes, which the Great Deku Tree, the guardian spirit of the Kokiri Forest, is beginning to sense as well. well. He asks Navi the fairy to seek out Link, and after becoming acquainted with her and getting equipped with a sword and a shield, Link meets with the Great Deku Tree, who tests his courage by asking him to explore his insides and break a curse that is slowly killing him. Link kills some spiders and lights some torches inside of the wooden tree, who is still very much alive.
Why did you set me on fire, SpongeBob?
But unfortunately, it's too late. Before dying, the Great Deku Tree tells Link of the man responsible for placing the curse on him, a Gerudo thief who is searching for a way into the sacred realm where the legendary Triforce is said to be hidden. The Triforce was left behind by the three creators of the world, the three goddesses Din, Nehru, and Furore, with each piece of the Triforce corresponding to one of the goddesses' powers. Link is told to go to Hyrule Castle and meet with Princess Zelda, taking the spiritual stone of the forest with him. Before leaving the forest, one of Link's childhood friends, a girl named Saria, entrusts him with her fairy ocarina as a token and reminder of their friendship. Link reacts in the funniest way possible though, as he just runs off after receiving it. I know it's meant to come off more as him having second thoughts about leaving his friend and home behind, but I like to interpret it as him going, ew, cooties, after sneaking past the world's most laughably incompetent guards, one of whom tries to bomb a child. Hey look, there's Mario.
Hello, Mario.
Link finds Princess Zelda, who upon seeing him with the spiritual stone puts all of her trust in him as the hero who will save Hyrule from the Gerudo thief the Great Deku Tree told us about, now revealed to be
Ganondorf.
Zelda tells Link that unfortunately for
Ganondorf.
the sacred realm he is seeking is locked behind the Door of Time in the Temple of Time. The keys to opening it are the three spiritual stones and the Ocarina of Time. She asks Link to find the other two spiritual stones before
Ganondorf
does, which he sets out to do after being escorted out of the castle by her loyal protector Impa, a member of the Sheikah tribe. Link eventually obtains the spiritual stone of fire, given to him by the Goron leader Darunia in Death Mountain, after clearing out all of the Dodongos in Dodongo's cavern.
Great! I can't wait to bomb some.
Don't you dare finish that sentence. Don't do it. I'm sick of it.
And the spiritual stone of water, given to him by Princess Ruto, princess of the Zoras, after saving her from the inside of Jabu Jabu's belly and agreeing to accept it as an engagement ring. It's not like he's actually engaged though. How could they be? They're just kids. It's not like time can magically skip ahead 7 or so years to force him to take responsibility and take their vows seriously. So instead of dwelling on that, Link heads off to the castle with all 3 spiritual stones in hand. Upon arriving at the drawbridge though, the nightmare Link had at the beginning of the game begins to play out for real, as he sees Impa and Zelda taking off as they're being chased by
Ganondorf.
Failing to stop
Ganondorf
from chasing after them, Link instead picks up the item that Zelda tossed on her way out, the Ocarina of Time, and through a vision, she teaches him the Song of Time that will open the Door of Time. This pattern of naming everything after time in this game is going to make a lot of sense in a bit, as Link opens the Door of Time, finding the legendary Master Sword inside. Upon lifting it from its pedestal, the way to the sacred realm opens up. But little did he know that
Ganondorf
was just waiting around the corner for the boy to do that very thing. Link suddenly wakes up in the sacred realm and is greeted by Rauru, the Sage of Light. He not only reveals that
Ganondorf
seized the opportunity to grab the Triforce for himself once the sacred realm was open, but that Link has been asleep for 7 years and is now a full-grown adult. In that time, Princess Zelda has been missing, and with no one left to stop him,
Ganondorf
used the Triforce to become the King of Evil and take over Hyrule. Fortunately, not all hope is lost, as Rauru reveals that
Ganondorf
can still be stopped with the combined power of all the sages. He tells Link that as the chosen hero of time, he must save the 5 sages in the 5 temples and stop
Ganondorf's
reign of tyranny. Before leaving the Temple of Time, Link is stopped by the last member of the Sheikah tribe, Sheik, who will periodically show up during Link's quest to teach him songs that will let him warp around Hyrule and give him hints on what to do next to reach the next temple. The second half of the game centers around Link traveling to each temple to awaken the sages within. Although Hyrule Castle is the most obviously affected region from
Ganondorf's
rise to power, every area has been affected in some way. The Kokiri Forest is overrun with monsters, Death Mountain is being terrorized by the dragon Volvagia who has a hunger for Gorons, Zora's domain has been frozen over with most of the Zoras being encased in the ice, while Lake Hylia's water has been completely drained. And worst of all, Luigi's running a ranch now. One by one, Link goes to the temples and frees each of the sages, many of whom turn out to be people he met as a kid, like Saria, Darunia, Impa, and Ruto, who is less than happy about Link f***ing off for the past 7 years right after they got engaged. Without even trying, Link is now part of the male stereotype of running off to get the milk and never coming back. The 5th sage is a character you only meet upon entering their temple, Naburu, the Gerudo tribe's second in command, though she doesn't agree with
Ganondorf's
ways of killing, so she's pretty cool. Once all the sages have been rescued, Link returns to the Temple of Time where he meets with Sheik once again. Sheik thanks him for rescuing the sages and tells him more about the Triforce, how when
Ganondorf
obtained it 7 years ago, he didn't actually fully obtain the whole thing. It split into 3 pieces and he was only left with the Triforce of Power. Link just so happens to be the holder of the Triforce of Courage, and the Triforce of Wisdom is said to be in the possession of the 7th and final sage. The symbol appears on Sheik's hand and they reveal themselves as Princess Zelda, probably the earliest example of a major spoiler being ruined by the Smash Bros. Series, and certainly not the last. Zelda assumed the role of Ashika to remain hidden from Ganondorf all this time, and now that all the sages have been awakened, they can use their power to seal him in the Sacred Realm for all eternity. However, she probably should have stayed in her disguise a little longer, as Ganondorf has been watching Link this entire time just waiting for the princess to show herself. He kidnaps Zelda and dares Link to come save her at his castle where the climax of the game takes place. Thanks to the light arrows given to him by Zelda before she was taken away, Link manages to defeat Ganondorf once. But even after his castle collapses on top of him, he uses the Triforce of Power and sheer force of will to rise from the rubble and become Ganon, probably the best version of Ganon in the entire series. His design is so cool, wielding 2 giant swords and the dark clouds keeping him mostly in shadow in the N64 version where you can only see his glowing eyes, and glimpses of his full form when lightning strikes. After rolling between Ganon's legs a few times, Link manages to defeat him with a stab to the freaking head. God damn. The sages successfully seal the King of Evil away, though not before he swears to kill Link and Zelda's descendants when he breaks out of his seal one day. Should have given him the death penalty instead. This version of Ganondorf does not mess around. This is the first game to introduce his human form, and like with his pig form, this is my favorite iteration of him. This game takes the Jaws approach, where the main villain doesn't show up often, but when he does, he absolutely steals the show and it's treated like a big event. Ganondorf is just pure evil and really has no motivation aside from conquering the world just for the sake of it. And sometimes a great villain doesn't need anything more than that. Motherfucker has an organ that he uses to play his own theme song on. What a badass. With Hyrule safe and sound, Zelda sends Link back in time for good so he can live the 7 years he lost. The whole world celebrates, Navi leaves now that her duty has been fulfilled, though I don't know why she couldn't just stick around to keep the kid company, especially since the next game starts with Link looking for her. Looks like their friendship only went one way. That bitch. Ocarina of Time has a basic plot, but being basic doesn't mean it's bad. Not at all. It is a classic tale that pretty much checks all of the boxes that I've come to expect from a Zelda game. I mean, it has everything. The Master Sword, the Hylian Shield, the goddesses, the Triforce, the sages, Gorons, Zoras, Gerudo, Zelda, Impa, Ganondorf, Hyrule Dual Worlds. Ocarina of Time, to me, is the most Zelda-y 3D Zelda game of them all, if that makes any sense. When every future game introduces some sort of new gimmick or removes one of the things I just mentioned, it makes Ocarina's simplicity stand out and gives it an appeal that the other titles just can't replicate. And really, this extends to those games as well. I love that they all feel different from each other, even when some reuse assets or when others are clearly more inspired by a previous entry than the rest. Every 3D Zelda game is conceptually unique, and Ocarina of Time has the added benefit of being the most familiar and classic of the bunch, which makes it a great starting point for people interested in the franchise. Its characters aren't the most deep or developed, and some don't even have that much dialogue, but they're all so memorable from their iconic designs and funny quirks. Even Link, despite never saying a word, has some really endearing moments, like when he's running away from the Gorons who try to give him a hug, when he gets eaten by Jabu Jabu, gets scared by the Deku Tree Sprout, and when he desecrates a royal grave and gets punished with a bolt of lightning. The voice acting only makes these moments funnier. Well, there isn't any spoken dialogue, but this is the first Zelda game to give the characters voices. These don't count, smartass. Link's voice actors, Fujiko Takimoto who plays young Link, and Nobuyuki Hiyama who plays adult Link, are iconic. Their voices are ingrained in my memory for the rest of time, cause goddamn can they scream. I really like Link's characterization in this game, no matter how minimal it may be. Going from a kid who nobody takes seriously and gets easily bested by Ganondorf, to the hero of time, the world's last hope facing horrors beyond comprehension. Now, how he learned to be so good with a sword, I have no idea. Ocarina of Time's biggest challenge was making hand-to-hand swordplay work in a 3D environment, and needless to say, they nailed it about as best as they could have. Navi, apart from serving as your guide and reminder to take breaks and go outside, is also who helps you lock onto enemies, which I have to say is a really clever way of explaining the targeting system in the context of the game's world. By holding down the lock-on button, you can focus on a certain enemy, meaning all you have to worry about is positioning yourself to avoid attacks and waiting for the right opportunity to hit them. Swinging the sword 3 times consecutively does a short combo, and holding down the B button lets you charge up a spin attack, which is really useful for crowd control. You can also do a spin attack on the fly by rotating the analog stick quickly and pressing the B button, but I've personally always been terrible at this and just end up swinging at nothing like a damn moron. The most satisfying attack you can do though is the jump attack, which does twice the amount of damage as a regular sword swing. This attack is awesome, especially if you can land it after jumping off of a ledge. While Link can't jump manually when exploring, much to my younger self's horror, as jumping can only be done when running off ledges to perform an auto jump, you can do a backflip and sidestep while holding the lock-on button and pressing A while holding the corresponding direction on the analog stick. If dodging isn't your cup of tea, you can also defend by blocking enemy attacks with your shield, though young Link has a unique type of block when equipped with the Hylian shield. Since it's too heavy for him to wield with one hand, he keeps it on his back and uses it like a shell to block attacks coming from above, which works really well when going up against enemies much taller than you and for protecting yourself from falling rocks. It's really commendable just how seamless this combat is. Pretty much every action game nowadays worth their salt has a targeting system of some kind, and Ocarina of Time implemented it as if it was just copying something that came before it, yet it was the game that invented the mechanic in the first place. This solves so many potential issues there would have been if there wasn't a targeting system. Enemies that are above you like keys can now be focused on without worrying about them constantly being out of reach and out of sight. Trying to fight an enemy one-on-one without locking onto them would be a nightmare. You'd have to constantly reposition yourself since many enemies in this game like to move and jump around a lot. With a lock-on, you can strafe to avoid incoming attacks while still keeping your opponent in your sights. For all of this to have been executed so well on the first attempt is truly something worthy of praise. In the N64 version, the lock-on can be kind of finicky, while the 3DS version fine-tuned it to be more accurate and reliable, but both are still more than playable. It's a shame then that the combat has brought down a bit, since a lot of the difficulty of fighting Ocarina's enemies comes from certain fights taking too long. Wolfos and Stalfos, I honestly have no idea what, if anything, causes them to let their guard down. Sometimes you'll just be waiting for what feels like forever because they refuse to let you hit them, which is their job technically. I mean, this game would be near impossible to beat if Ganondorf simply orders Stalfos to always keep their shields up, but I don't think they make for very fun fights. To make matters worse, some Stalfos encounters make you fight two of them at the same time, and sometimes if you killed one of them already, it will come back to life if you take too long to kill the other one, which can get really problematic when they're too stubborn to drop their shields. Funny story, I ran out the timer during the escape sequence at the end of the game the very first time I played, for that very reason. Probably my least favorite enemy type though is the clams in the water temple, specifically in the N64 version, because I swear that their hurt boxes are janky as hell, and they also make you play the waiting game. As for enemies I do like, I like fighting the Dongos and Armos, since the challenge here lies in getting around them to hit their weak point, or being able to successfully toss a bomb at them. Redeads have to be approached carefully and taken care of quickly before their shrieks stop you in your tracks, leaving you vulnerable to getting dry humped. The Iron Knuckle is a very difficult enemy on your first playthrough, as their attack has a long reach and does an insane amount of damage, punishing you for being greedy and trying to land attacks when it's winding up for one of its own. So while not all of these enemies are winners in my book, the enemy design is still solid overall, and the variety of enemies by itself is something that even newer Zelda games struggle with. The bosses, unfortunately, are also sort of a mixed bag. I like how many of them are designed to be like puzzles, requiring you to know which item to use and how to use it to reveal their weak point, but some of these guys are just too damn easy and simple. Now Goma makes sense, she is the first boss after all, and she teaches you the importance of scanning a room for threats before proceeding. King Dodongo is an absolute joke, having 2 main attacks and going down with 2 jump attacks from a wooden stick. Bongo Bongo, on top of being really easy, sharing the same weakness as the first boss and that one boss in the pyramid in Mario 64, is just annoying to fight, since he keeps making you jump in the air, making it annoyingly hard to lock onto him. And I also think Twin Rova is a pretty boring fight, although it's saved a bit by the humorous banter between Koume and Kotake after you defeat them. The other bosses are definitely much better though, or at the very least more interesting. Baronade is more challenging than some of the bosses you fight as an adult, sporting multiple attacks that force you to take an evasive approach. Volvagia is an awesome fight simply for the spectacle, fighting a fire-breathing dragon with flames and lava all around you. Bonus points for being the only enemy that you need the Megaton Hammer to defeat. Amoeba is memorable for the water effect alone, and this attack that never fails to catch me off guard for some reason. Dark Link is a great tribute to Zelda 2. I love how your reflection in the water disappears and it manifests itself as him. He's really hard if you've been collecting a lot of heart containers since his health scales with your own, and he'll mirror every one of your attacks if you lock onto him, making for an epic sword clashing duel. You can also just humiliate him with the Big Goron sword, Megaton Hammer, or Din's Fire and remove all sense of tension this fight had. The first phase of the Phantom Ganon fight is neat, but he's sadly downgraded when the second phase becomes a game of hitting energy balls back and forth, which the actual fight against Ganondorf also amounts to. Though what's interesting is that you can't lock onto him and he has some other attacks to spice things up. My favorite is this one where he tries to summon a barrage of energy balls that you can either interrupt with a light arrow if you're quick enough, or deflect back at him with a charged spin attack. And I already mentioned how much I love the Ganon fight, especially with all the different ways you can approach it. Don't do what I did as a kid though and spend a bunch of time on his second phase, because I didn't know that you need to fight him with the Master Sword or the battle will go on forever. While I'm not really a big fan of some of these bosses, at the very least most of the time, the dungeons leading up to the weaker ones make up for their mediocrity. The exploration and things you can do in the overworld can be just as interesting as these dungeons though, so I think I'm gonna talk about that first. Between each major dungeon, you explore more of Hyrule to access the next one, often thanks to a new item you just acquired in the previous dungeon. But there isn't much stopping you from ignoring your current objective and exploring other areas at your own leisure. After you leave Kokiri Forest, the starting area that does a great job at teaching you the game's movement, you're thrown into Hyrule Field, a vast stretch of land acting as a hub with paths leading to every major region. While there may not be much to do in many of these areas when first stepping foot into Hyrule Field, you can surprisingly go to many of these places right out the gate. Ocarina of Time is usually criticized for being too linear, but I beg to differ. Sure, if all you do is just go to each dungeon without doing anything else, the progression is pretty straightforward, but each area is littered with secrets to uncover, side quests to complete, mini games to play, and new faces to meet. Hyrule Field itself though, I can't defend this place even if I wanted to. While it too does have secrets to find, many of them don't amount to much aside from the occasional hole in the ground that may or may not contain a useful item. And these small underground areas are separated by what might as well be a barren wasteland with a green coat of paint that you have to trek through over and over again on foot during the first third of the game. The day and night cycle is really cool and the music is awesome, but Hyrule Field is pretty uninteresting otherwise. This is where the other areas come in to pick up the slack. Castletown is filled with quirky NPCs, shops, which I never use, and mini games to get upgrades to your equipment, though the Bombchu bowling alley can off because of the cuckoos that constantly get in the way and the randomness of the prizes you can obtain. What's funny is that at night, the market gets filled with a bunch of dogs, and one of them is even part of a short side quest where you return it to its owner, who named the dog Richard, by the way. No wonder he ran away. Kakariko Village is such a relaxing place to visit, but there's hints of it having a dark past. What with the bottom of the well being one of the creepiest areas in the game that acted as a prison for Bongo Bongo, and the Shadow Temple, which is literally located right next to the graveyard. And speaking of the graveyard, it's home to Dompe the Gravekeeper, who holds a minigame where you painstakingly have to watch him walk slowly to each patch of dirt to pay him to dig it up for you for the chance of getting a heart piece. Every time I replay this game, I can never get the heart piece on my first try. I always run out of money and have to come back later. Oh, and how can I forget the cute cuckoos that Kakariko Village is filled with? Lon Lon Ranch is owned by the lazy man Talon. You become friends with his daughter Malin and she introduces you to the horse Epona. The Lost Woods involves you following wherever the music is loudest to take the correct path to reach Saria the first time you go through here. But what's weird is that that isn't the case whenever you come back, so I'm not sure how you're expected to navigate it aside from just memorizing the layout through trial and error. The Lost Woods is also an area that I have to thank Navi for hinting me to go to on my first playthrough, cause I don't think that I would have been able to figure out that the song you need to play for Darunia is Saria's song. Navi being obnoxious is about as commonly known as oxygen being the air we breathe, but I actually don't really mind her in cases like these. This isn't the only time where the way forward isn't very obvious, and her guidance actually comes in handy. She's also helpful in case you need strategies for beating specific enemies. She only really gets annoying when she reminds you of where you should be going when you're already there. The Owl, on the other hand, is much worse than Navi, especially since he tries to trick you into repeating everything he just said, and likes to respawn if you leave an area and come back like a goddamn stalker. I love Death Mountain and Goron City if only for the Gorons. They're literally surrounded by rocks and claim that they're starving when you arrive. Now I don't feel so bad about blowing this one up.
You took my only food! Now I'm gonna starve!
Zora River is where you can find the magic bean seller, whose business is failing when you first meet him, but the more magic beans you buy, the more he charges you for them. And then he has the audacity to call them world famous after you buy enough of them. Bitch, I'm your only customer. Ocarina of Time taught me supply and demand before I even took an economics class. Zora's domain is such a majestic area, home to the most majestic race in all of Hyrule. Lake Hylia is mostly water, go figure, but you can meet some scarecrows that will help you in the future if you teach them a song. You can theoretically put thought into the melody you play for them, or you can just do what I do. Other than that, there isn't much more to say about this place. This has got to be the worst minigame in the entire Zelda series. Fishing in Ocarina of Time is absolutely dreadful, and you have to do it twice if you want to get 100%. Both times you have to catch the biggest fish in the pond, but the controls are not explained well at all. It's not clear at all what you're supposed to do to keep the fish from escaping. I swear it's more luck based than anything. It's even worse in the 3DS version since my thumb keeps slipping off of the circle pad, and it wouldn't even be so bad if the fish didn't piss off to the deepest part of the pond if it escapes, which your regular fishing rod can't reach, meaning you have to leave and pay the man another 20 rupees for another try. And if you're wondering if I've ever caught the Hylian loach, well, ask yourself this: when you stub your toe, do you really want to go through that again? Now, a lot of these areas I mentioned become even more interesting when you consider how different they are when you unlock the ability to travel to the future. Castletown is completely now filled with re-deads and forcing all of the residents to move to Kakariko Village. Lon Lon Ranch is taken over by the farmhand Ingo, after being sick of working for the lazy bum Talon for so many years. Talon and Ingo are basically Mario and Luigi, if Mario retired and just decided to sit on his royalty checks for the rest of his life and make his brother work for him. If you befriended Epona in the past, you can now ride her and challenge Ingo to a race to keep her, the outcome of which he doesn't respect, which forces you to just steal her by hopping over the fence. Epona makes traveling across Hyrule Field much more tolerable, and she's basically required for a big side quest later in the game, though strangely she is completely optional if you just do the story. It took me the longest time to find out that if you go back to the ranch, not only do you see that Ingo has changed his ways, but you can take part in an obstacle course set up by Malin, and your reward for finishing it is an unlimited supply of milk delivered to your house. Free cow delivery right to your home, only in Hyrule. Zora's domain is frozen over, as I said in the plot synopsis, though it's not so sad when you realize that King Zora is also frozen. Good, teaches him a lesson for taking forever to move out of the way when I was a kid. The last region is Gerudo Valley, one of the only places that only adult Link can access. The Gerudo Fortress segment has you stealthily avoiding the Gerudo guards and exploring the fortress to rescue some kidnapped carpenters. If you get caught, you get thrown in a cell, but they never think to take away your equipment. I kind of like this part of the game, getting to use your bow and arrow to knock out the guards, and the actual fights against the Gerudo warriors can be pretty intense since they have an attack that can instantly knock you out. The Gerudo are one of the most interesting factions in the series to me, a tribe exclusively made up of women with only one man being born every 100 years and being crowned as their king, which they don't welcome men into their ranks except for the only Gerudo male, and they just make him their leader without question, and as you see, it worked out great. Ocarina of Time's Hyrule is so easy to get attached to. While a lot of these areas are returning from A Link to the Past, the way they're depicted in Ocarina of Time became the staple for how they'd be depicted in future Zelda games, down to where they're located geographically. dramatically, and the way that they're expanded upon once you reach the adult section of the game is awesome, like the new Ice Cavern mini dungeon in Zora's Fountain, and the bottom of the well mini dungeon in Kakariko Village, the latter of which gets unlocked when you pull off a classic time loop paradox by playing the Song of Storms as a child, after learning as an adult about how a kid messed up the windmill 7 years ago. I love stuff like this. I honestly wish the game played more with the ability to travel back and forth between the two time periods. You only have to do it twice to reach the end of the game, and I think it would have been super interesting if it was baked into the main adventure more than it was. And since I brought up the Song of Storms, oh yeah, I haven't even talked about the ocarina. First off, isn't it a little messed up that Link basically forgets about the fairy ocarina he got from Saria immediately after getting the Ocarina of Time? I kind of wish there was an option to switch between the two in the gear screen, since it's really only needed to open the door of time and get rid of these time blocks. Anyways, this game essentially started the tradition of Zelda games having plot important musical instruments. Technically there was the flute in Zelda 1, and the ocarina even made an appearance in both A Link to the Past and Link's Awakening, but this game puts much more emphasis on it. During your journey, you'll learn a variety of songs that each serve a different purpose, like the Sun Song, which changes the time of day, and all the warp songs you learn from Sheik to help you get around Hyrule a lot quicker. Certain songs though, like the Song of Time, are very situational. Honestly, the coolest thing about the ocarina is how you can create almost any song you want with it. There's only 5 basic notes, but you can change them depending on the direction you hold the control stick in. I've seen some impressive videos online of people playing popular songs on the ocarina, and it's even more fun in Majora's Mask as you get more instruments to play with in that game. And can I just say how nice it is to get to play one of the 64 Zelda games with an N64 controller, since now I can use the C buttons to play the ocarina instead of having to awkwardly use an analog stick and making me more prone to making mistakes. Spending time messing around with the ocarina is one of my favorite things to do in this game, though it would have been nice if some of the songs didn't feel like afterthoughts in terms of how often they're actually needed. Like the Song of Storms is a great tune, but it's only needed twice. Once to drain the well, and again to open this hole in the ground to reach a gold Skulltula. The only hole in the entire game that doesn't open with a bomb for some reason, which I'm sure didn't piss off anybody crazy enough to go after every gold Skulltula. Alright, I've talked about a couple of the side quests already, but I may as well go over the rest of them now. The one that spans across the whole game is the gold Skulltula hunt. There are 100 in total, and they are everywhere, even in dungeons. You get a reward for every 10 you kill, ranging from wallet upgrades, an item that reveals hidden holes in the ground, f***ing bomb chews, and getting all 100 of them nets you an unlimited supply of huge rupees, in a game where rupees are abundant and damn near useless. Don't get all the gold Skulltulas. Some of them can be a pain to find or are just way too out of the way, like the ones that require you to revisit dungeons. Just get at least 50 of them, which is totally doable to get the rewards that actually matter. Other rewards I don't think are that great are the ones you get from finding the Great Fairies. Before Xenoblade 2, Ocarina of Time was what made me afraid of showing my parents what I was playing. The Great Fairies get you the upgraded spin attack and magic meter, a defense upgrade in the game's last hour, woohoo, but the 3 most notable ones are Din's Fire, Furor's Wind, and Nehru's Love. Din's Fire is very situational, though it does make for a great attack if you're surrounded by a bunch of enemies. Furor's Wind can only be used in dungeons, letting you create a checkpoint that you can return to at any time, which I guess is nice if you find yourself returning to a certain room often, but I've never really found a use for it. I guess it would help if you have to cut a dungeon run short, since when you restart your save file, you start at the entrance of the dungeon. Nehru's Love makes you invincible for a brief period of time, but again, I rarely ever use it since you get it right before the last temple and it honestly feels kind of cheap. As an adult, you can do the Big Poe quest. This ghost shop owner asks you to bring them Poes you capture in bottles, promising you a reward when you get 1,000 points. Hyrule Field has 10 hidden Big Poes, each worth 100 points, and Jesus are they hidden. Even if you can find them all on your own, some of them are so hard to kill, requiring you to line yourself up in a very specific way so that they don't run into a wall before you can kill them. And this side quest really shows how much the horse riding controls suck. I swear that Epona gets stuck on everything. Sometimes she gets stuck on what looks like nothing. This was before they invented the technology that prevents horses from running into shit. Your reward for getting 1,000 points?
There and Dan.
The Happy Mask trade quest is one of 2 trade quests in the game, where you travel around the world finding people to sell masks to. Only problem is that aside from the first mask, nothing in the game tells you who wants which mask, which means that without a guide, you pretty much have to go around and talk to everybody with a mask equipped, which I guess was the point, because certain NPCs have some pretty funny reactions to certain masks, but it still feels like a waste of time more than anything. Your ultimate reward is 500 rupees. I've already said that rupees aren't that valuable in this game, so this isn't fulfilling at all, and you get to borrow the Mask of Truth, which lets you talk to these gossip stones that admittedly do have some pretty interesting and humorous facts about the world and characters, but it loses its appeal rather quickly. Thankfully, the last big side quest, the Big Goron Sword trade quest, isn't absolutely worthless. This trade quest, apart from actually telling you where to go in the 3DS version, grants you the Big Goron Sword, the most powerful weapon in the game other than the Deku Stick. You can't use your shield while using it, but that doesn't matter when it has such a long reach and kills even the most dangerous monsters in a couple of hits. What's funny is that you can buy a weapon that's essentially identical to the Big Goron Sword, the Giant's Knife. That means you can skip this whole quest entirely then, right? Also, the 3DS version actually changes the design of the sheath when you have the Big Goron Sword equipped, as opposed to the original which uses the same sheath as the Master Sword. Don't ask me why, but this is a big deal to me. Oh right, I almost forgot to bring up the treasure chest minigame you can play in Castletown. How do you play?
That's right, we're gonna cheat.
I mean, it's basically impossible to beat without the Lens of Truth, since it's completely random which chest contains the key to the next room. Though I would like to point out that in my 3DS playthrough, every key ended up being inside of the bottom chest. Somebody calculate the odds of that happening. I'm too lazy to do it myself. The Lens of Truth is only one of Link's vast arsenal of items. Items that range from the Deku Stick, which funnily enough is as strong as the Master Sword, to Deku Nuts that allow you to stun enemies. Though I noticed that the Deku Nuts are one of the least used items for many players, despite them actually being very practical in combat. The Magic Beans I brought up earlier are a neat example of a fun gameplay mechanic involving the time travel. You plant the Magic Beans in soft soil as a kid so that you can ride the Magic Lily Pad as an adult, to obtain out-of-reach items or create shortcuts. And empty bottles let you store potions, fairies that revive you upon death, and you can even catch certain creatures with them, like bugs that spawn gold Skulltulas when you drop them in soft soil, and fish, because the fish economy in Hyrule is absolutely f***ed. Most of the items, however, are acquired in the dungeons. While Ocarina's set of dungeons aren't my favorite in the series, a few of them are still pretty noteworthy, for better or for worse. The Great Deku Tree is super easy, but that's completely fine as it does a great job of teaching the player how the rest of the dungeons and puzzles in this game will play out, like using Deku Sticks to light torches and burn cobwebs, and taking advantage of the 3D environment and first-person mode to look around the room for an eyeball or switch to open the way forward. The main item here is the Slingshot, great for helping you take care of those pesky keys and Skulltulas that are on the walls. The Dongo's Cavern ramps up the difficulty, but not by much. You're pretty much required to use your Hylian shield, since your Deku shield will burn if it comes into contact with fire. The main item you get here is the bomb bag, allowing you to carry bombs to break open weak walls and defeat certain tough enemies. Throwing bombs in this game doesn't feel very graceful though, since you have to be walking with a bomb in order to throw it, otherwise you'll just place it right in front of you and blow your face off. Jabu Jabu's belly, aside from this one section that can be slightly confusing because of how many doors there are, isn't too bad of a dungeon either. I love the concept though, playing with the idea of being inside a living being that isn't a tree. It reminds me a lot of Monstro from Kingdom Hearts. The main item is the Boomerang, a mid-range weapon that doesn't go as far as the Slingshot, but it can collect distant items and stun enemies. The Forest Temple is the first adult dungeon, and the complexity certainly gets dialed up here. This is the first dungeon with small keys, and this is where the challenge really stems from, since you'll often run into a dead end if you don't have enough keys for a locked door, meaning you'll have to backtrack and explore to find any you missed. This is also where the game starts leaning more towards being creepy, as the main goal of this dungeon involves you hunting down the 4 Post Sisters to open the way to the boss door. The atmospheric music only adds to the unsettling vibe of this place. Certain items young Link was able to use can't be used by adult Link, and vice versa. So to replace the Slingshot, you get the bow for your long-range sniping needs. The part of this dungeon that really stumped me as a kid was the Twisted Hallway, where you have to hit the eyeball to change the hallway's orientation in order to get the boss key. But I didn't know that you could shoot it again to change it back to the way it was, which you need to do to get to the first 2 Post Sisters. Still, this is one of my personal favorite dungeons in the game. Same goes for the Fire Temple, the main gimmick here being that you have to save the Gorons, with each of them giving you a small key to help you explore more of the dungeon. In terms of difficulty, I think it's about on par with the Forest Temple, which makes sense when you realize that you can technically tackle these two dungeons in any order. The item you need to access each is the hookshot, which you get in the Kakariko graveyard from racing Dompe's ghost. The hookshot is awesome, replacing the boomerang as your main item to stun enemies and bring items towards you, but it can also be used to propel you forward by attaching itself on certain surfaces. An item that's not so awesome though is the one you get in the Fire Temple, the Megaton Hammer, a severely underutilized tool that could have been designed as an alternate weapon to your sword, but it's instead relegated to hitting these pillars and rusty switches because of how short range it is. After this dungeon, it's rarely ever used again. But now we get to the Water Temple.
Oh, no.
Okay, the Water Temple isn't that bad if you're playing the 3DS version. On the N64, it's pretty bad. A lot of the dungeon takes place underwater, which means that you need the iron boots in order to sink, an item you get from completing the Ice Cavern mini dungeon. In the N64 version, the iron boots have to be equipped and unequipped via the pause screen, which is super tedious. But that's not even the worst of it. Combat is incredibly limited underwater because you can only use the hookshot, and this place is crawling with those clams I mentioned earlier. I don't even like shellfish, but now I'm gonna eat as many of you as I can out of spite. This dungeon's main gimmick revolves around changing the water level to access new areas, but it's difficult to remember your first time how the water level will be changed, or where each of the triggers are to change it in the first place. And there's one part where raising the water lifts a platform out of the way that was blocking a previously inaccessible area, but it's super easy to not even notice because the camera does a terrible job of highlighting it. And to rub salt in the wound, there's this stupid Tektite that always gets in the way when you try to ride this water pillar, and all of this adds up to a dungeon that leaves a bad taste in your mouth. The 3DS version fixes all of this by making the iron boots mappable to one of your 4 item slots that you can toggle on and off at your leisure, and making it more obvious with markings on the walls where to go to change the water level and telling you how the water level will be changed. It also fixes the hurt boxes on the clams. That alone makes this my preferred version. At least this is the dungeon where you fight Dark Link, and for your troubles, you get the long shot. It's exactly like the hook shot, but longer. This is you, this is the guy she tells you not to worry about. With the Lens of Truth, you can tackle the Shadow Temple or Spirit Temple in any order. Though the game heavily pushes you toward completing the Shadow Temple first, there's a lot of evidence showing that it should be the last dungeon you tackle. The ordering of the songs in the pause screen and temple symbols in the Spirit Realm, and Impa's speech to you after completing the dungeon all stand out to me as this being meant to be the final regular dungeon, which is hilarious if true, since this is the easiest dungeon in the game next to the Great Deku Tree. The Shadow Temple, going off of difficulty, should have been the first Adult Link dungeon. You only ever need one small key at any given time, and you almost always use it shortly after you obtain it. You can literally draw a line from the beginning to the end, while most of the previous dungeons had a central room that branched off to different sections. The only part that stumped me was this treasure chest hidden under some rubble that you need to blow away with a bomb. Other than that, the only other reason I could think of for why it's placed so late in the game is that it's spooky. There's skeletons, voices telling you about Hyrule's bloody history, and this f***ing thing that is legitimately terrifying and would have given me nightmares if I was any younger. As for the items, you use the Lens of Truth you got from the bottom of the well to reveal invisible walls and stuff, and the main item, the hover boots, are selectively used to cross gaps that you can't make with a normal jump. They make you super slippery though, so you still have to pause and unpause in the N64 version to take them on and off. The Spirit Temple isn't that much more complicated to get through than the Shadow Temple, but it makes up for it thanks to its unique gimmick. First off, getting to the temple is pretty cool, making you go through this haunted wasteland with a lone merchant on a carpet selling bomb juice for some reason, but the main appeal of the Spirit Temple is that you have to do the first half as Young Link and the second half as Adult Link. At the end of the Young Link section, you get the Iron Gauntlets, an item you promised to get for Naburu, who gets captured by the witches Koume and Kotake, forcing you to return as an adult and use the Iron Gauntlets to explore the rest of the dungeon. I love this idea so much. The Iron Gauntlets, not so much. They're only used to push heavier than normal blocks and pick up certain boulders. They don't make your attack stronger, unfortunately. At least the next main item, the Mirror Shield, sort of makes up for it, being the only shield that can't be taken away from you by fire or a stupid like, and required to solve the dungeon's many light-themed puzzles. This is also the first time that bomb juice are required, another painfully situational item that is only used one other time after this. Having a bomb that can climb up walls is really creative, but it's sadly not used a lot. Also, you can hookshot onto the Desert Colossus statue's tits. Rated E for everyone. Technically, there is one other dungeon that's completely optional, the Gerudo Training Grounds. It puts nearly all of your items and skills to the test by putting familiar puzzles and enemies from previous dungeons into one series of rooms. It's kind of redundant considering that Ganon's castle basically does the same thing, but at least the reward is good, right?
Wrong!
The ice arrows, seeing as they come from a completely optional dungeon, are never needed for anything, not even for other optional collectibles. In combat, they freeze enemies in place, which is helpful, I guess, but this is right before the end of the game. The fire arrows also aren't that useful, but at least they're less forgettable because of how you obtain them. This is it. This is the most useless item in the whole game. Second place is nothing to be proud of either. Ganon's castle, as I said, is an amalgamation of all of the adult dungeons, with each section being themed around one of them, and opening the way to Ganondorf requires you to finish all of them. Curiously, however, there's a section themed around the light sage who didn't have a temple of his own, and the forest temple section focuses on wind puzzles, while the water temple section is more reminiscent of the ice cavern than the actual water temple. Ocarina of Time, and a lot of N64 games in general now that I think about it, has an incredibly interesting beta and iceberg of trivia, theories, and unused content that people have made multi-hour long videos about. Early versions of the game, for example, have lots of elements that were removed from future releases, like red blood being cut from the final bosses, and certain symbols on blocks and the mirror shield having to be changed to remove any religious association from the game. The Fire Temple theme famously featured a Muslim chant in these early releases of the game as well. Ganon was originally meant to be much larger, and the fight involved you climbing up his body, an idea later reused in Super Mario Galaxy of all games for the Mega Leg boss. Early footage of the game showed Link opening a chest that contained the Triforce, suggesting that the Triforce was going to be an item that you could find, maybe in a scrapped light temple. Ura Zelda, before getting stripped down to what would become Master Quest, was supposed to also include new enemies on top of the remixed dungeons, and new dungeons were potentially also planned for it, like this unicorn fountain, which is also theorized to have been the location of the Triforce. The Forest Temple originally may have been themed more around wind, which makes a lot of sense considering the section in Ganon's castle and the symbol on the Forest Medallion. Similarly, the Water Medallion symbol looks an awful lot like a snowflake, though I think this more so suggests that there were plans to include an Ice Temple in conjunction with the Water Temple, with the remnants of that being the Ice Cavern in the final game. All of these mysteries and beta elements led to Ocarina of Time being one of those games that you'd spread rumors about with your friends at school. I got the Triforce and the Sword Beam attack in my game, and I also beat the Running Man, but I can't show you because my save file got deleted. Yeah, right, Jimmy, we all know you're full of shit. But come closer, kids, because I was able to unfreeze Zora's domain. 100% legit, I swear. First, you kill 69 stall children. Second, kill 101 gold Skulltulas. And third, and this is very important, so listen up, go to Zora's domain, equip the ocarina, and play this song. But all of these kinds of rumors and speculation wouldn't be nearly as interesting to talk about if the game they were about wasn't so special and cherished already. Ocarina of Time is everything that it set out to be, and then some. It became the blueprint for every subsequent 3D Zelda game and every 3D adventure game that followed. It's charming, funny, groundbreaking, filled with a sense of childlike wonder and an epicness of legendary proportions. And this soundtrack, one of the all-time greats. So many songs that have been etched into our memories. Hyrule Field, Castletown, Zelda's Lullaby, The Song of Storms, Gerudo Valley, and the 3DS version's new credit sequence performed by a full orchestra in celebration of the franchise's 25th anniversary. This Ocarina of Time video is one of thousands you can find on this site alone. People continue to discuss it and share their experiences with others to this very day. For a game nearing 25 years old, it manages to stay fresh and relevant with all of the new discoveries being made and the ways that the fandom find to keep it exciting, like randomizers, speedruns that go as far as manipulating the game's memory, and going as far as reverse engineering the game to create a native PC port with modding and widescreen support. Ocarina of Time isn't leaving the sphere of the internet anytime soon. And although it's not my personal favorite game or even my favorite Zelda game, I will forever appreciate its legacy and impact that has proven to transcend time itself.